Yeah, all right, hi. Oh, yeah, turn it on. First, I'll do that. Study technology and media, so it's all good. Okay, so it's, ooh, yes, it's working. Okay, hi. I was born with a stage voice, so it's debatable whether I need this or not, but it's good for everyone. So we're all just gonna say like a couple short things and then have this sort of moderated discussion. So given our topic, I wanted to remind us all that throughout the history of the US, identity and especially race has played a really key role in the messages and strategies of those who produce and disseminate disinformation, as well as who is receptive to this disinformation. I'm drawing a lot here in what I'm going to talk about briefly from the important work of my CITAP colleagues, Alice Marwick and Rachel Kuo, who, shout out for folks who might be interested in this, created a syllabus and an accompanying essay on critical disinformation studies and the importance of incorporating history, power, and politics into how we think about disinformation. In this essay and the syllabus of readings that goes along with it, they powerfully argue that, especially given the sort of renewed attention that we have to disinformation in this country, but I would say around the world, that it's important that we expand what counts as disinformation to include a primary media strategy that has been used in the US to reproduce and to reinforce white supremacy and other hierarchies of power at the expense of those who lack social, political, and economic power. These disinformation campaigns have power and find receptive audiences because they tap into these deep stories, larger narratives about the way that we see and understand the world. For example, the whole modern notion of disinformation being so persuasive and polarizing rests on this deep story and narrative that there's some mythical past where we all agreed on what was true and what was false, which I'll just tell you is false. And so this is not to say that, a lot of the attention of disinformation is focused on the role of social media companies and social media platforms and spreading it. This doesn't mean that they don't have a role to play in this. But I think it's really important for us to think about that they are just one actor, one platform within a larger media, political, and social system that perpetuates these disinformation campaigns, including mainstream media, legacy media, and mainstream political actors. And this is not new. This is the history of the United States. I think one of the really important implications for expanding our idea of what counts as disinformation is to see the role that the press has played and continues to play in spreading racist disinformation. This can range from the support of outright racist disinformation to the kind of both sides reporting style that's endemic to media coverage of politics. For example, the press presenting the idea that former President Trump's plan to address the housing crisis in the United States is to deport millions of so-called illegal immigrants as being somehow a thing that you can just compare as another policy notion on the same sort of level as Vice President Harris's plan to build new housing and provide tax incentives for first-time homebuyers. Some of this false equivalence, comes from the norm of objectivity, which has been criticized by many journalists, including journalists noted Wesley Lowery, as a morally vacuous view from nowhere that in practice results in a view from whiteness. As our own PhD alum and now professor, Kathy Roberts-Ford, has written, objectivity, which originally meant evidentiary rigor, but has too often been practiced as naive empiricism and neutrality, remains the status quo in the American press. The press has really struggled to cover disinformation, and that's not without cause, right? Understanding these things that I'm talking about, the history, the context of any piece of information, how it fits into a narrative, much less at today's breadth is hard, much less at the breakneck pace of events, with a fractured and wide media ecosystem, and with less time, less money, and less support than is needed. But research also shows that purveyors of disinformation aim to manipulate these weaknesses in mainstream media systems by engaging in what scholars call trading up the chain, where disinformation actors work to get a story from a small, local, or niche platform into a media outlet that's more popular, like a national news service. This gets it in front of a much larger and wider audience than it might initially have had, and if successful, a line from a blog post or a tweet is now national news.
The research that our center has done has revealed that coverage of disinformation and even fact-checking can spread disinformation more. A significant portion of this engages in what we sort of call this wishy-washy form of both sides journalism, where one actor is alleging something patently false and another actor is alleging what is the truth. And this alleging language sort of equivocates these two things. This is especially pernicious when it's filtered through a partisan lens, like a lot of this racialized political disinformation is. So, drawing from principles that we've established at CITAP, we argue that, at least for research, analyses of disinformation are effective when they include grounding analyses of disinformation in history, society, culture, and politics. When we center analyses of how social differentiation, such as race, gender, class, shape these dynamics of disinformation, when we foreground questions of how institutional power and economic, social, and cultural and technological structures shape what this disinformation looks like, and stating and maintaining explicit commitments to justice and equality. And I would argue that versions of these same principles would be well applied to journalistic coverage of disinformation. So to take these same ideas, when the press covers disinformation about elections, such as the baseless charges that non-citizens are engaging in rampant voter fraud, they could point out, one, that the struggle for legal and practical enfranchisement of non-white voters and the long history of race-based voter suppression in this country, that the reasons why a party rooted in a white minority might wield this narrative, maybe they can only maintain power if portions of the majority are oppressed, point out the acceptance of these disinformation campaigns by state actors, such as our own state's ballot initiative to amend the Constitution to allow only citizen voters, which is of course already the law, and by upholding the democratic norm that equal enfranchisement and access to the ballot box is a fundamental aspect of a working democracy. Pass it over to my colleague, Francesca Tripodi.
All right. Hi, everybody. My talk is going to be very different than Shannon's, largely because I left my notebook in my car and realized it right before we all got up here. So my apologies. So my name is Francesca Tripodi, and I have been studying search and search systems for well over a decade now at this point. And a lot of my research focuses on why search is such an important part of spreading racialized disinformation. So really quickly, when I say the word search, what do you all think of? How do you search? Google. How do you all search? Sometimes. What about people that aren't paid by CITAP? Yes. Sometimes you use Twitter or X, right?
Twitter.
No, always Twitter forever. Okay, what else? What else do you use? Yeah?
They use the library.
The library? Oh, wow. Okay, amazing. All right. I would argue very few of us are carving out time in the library to find out. In fact, a lot of the work that I do is showing that more and more search is happening on mobile devices. It's not even happening on laptops. And a big part of my research is thinking about why the words we start with are so important and how those keywords end up driving us into very parallel internet. So we sometimes think about the internet as this window into the wider world, but what a lot of research has shown us is that this can sometimes reflect our biases back to us, but is also a corporate entity that is being wielded for political and corporate gain. And a lot of the amazing work by Sophia Noble has shown us that algorithms have an underlying aspect of oppression within them. So how does this relate to racialized disinformation? In the chapter that I wrote for this book, The Media in January 6th, which we apparently don't have right now, which I'm sad about, I hope you all can take a look at it. I'm sure it's at the library, if nothing else. I wrote a chapter on the long legacy of Stop the Steal and why this idea of Stop the Steal is actually a recycled and reused deep story. So what Shannon brought up in her very amazing opening remarks is that deep stories play a really important role in how we understand things around. And this concept of a deep story was created by sociologist Harvey Hochschild to talk about those narratives that are told and retold so often that they feel really true, even if they are not completely accurate. And so a deep story that I like to talk about to get us used to this conversation is the color of the sky. When I say the color of the sky, what comes to mind? Yeah, it's Carolina blue. Sorry, Georgie, for joining us here, right? So we have this idea of Carolina blue. And when you search the sky is blue, you're very much directed to information that confirms that belief. But if you search the sky is red, you might get another deep story, right? What might the red return? Any of us fishermen in the audience? Or sailors? Red skies at night, sailors delight. Red sky in the morning, sailors take warning. Search the sky is green and you get information about the sky turning green before a tornado. So in all of these scenarios, Google does a tremendous job of confirming that reality back to us. And this is also true when we think about what I refer to as ideological dialects. So if you take a search engine and you search for something like illegal alien voter fraud, or you search for something like undocumented voting rights, you're going to get very different returns that effectively keep you in these parallel internets and reinforce and reconfirm that reality. And so what I think a lot about is how search systems interact with or get shaped by these deep stories. And a big one is around election fraud. So the deep story of election fraud in the United States has been around since, surprise, surprise, Black people got the right to vote. And what W.E.B. Du Bois teaches us in his amazing book, Black Reconstruction in America, which he wrote in the 1930s, and he uses the word misinformation, was that after Black persons in the United Black men, because women didn't get the right to vote until later, after Black men got the right to vote following Reconstruction, they elected a record number of Black representatives to serve them in Congress. And shortly thereafter, this insidious misinformation began to spread, right? That somehow this election must have been stolen. Because this is predicated on even deeper racialized disinformation, that there is no way that a Black person could have been intelligent enough to organize and vote and create politics in a thriving democracy. So what W.E.B. Du Bois teaches us is that deep, deep story of election fraud has been told and retold so often that it is not true, it is not accurate, but it feels true to the people who think power should be beholden to them. And what my research shows is that when you do something like Stop the Steal, which was a huge driver to the riots that we saw happen on January 6th in our country, is that the Stop the Steal narrative was President Trump had claimed that this was the creation of MAGA Nation, but this was actually far from that, right? This was a heavily curated phrase that had been circulating back in 2016 when he thought he might lose and then quickly faded into obscurity when he won that election. We saw a spike in Stop the Steal traffic happen again in 2022, and then it was actually happening at such a high level in the days leading up to January 6th that Google was actually auto-completing Stop the with Steal and directing people to the closest rally via Facebook for them to work at. So I will pass it along now so we can have some more discussion, but the big thing that I would love for us to think about is how are these keywords crafted? How are they tied to deep stories? And how are search engines weaponized in order to spread disinformation in a very insidious way?
Thank you. Good afternoon or evening again. I'm thinking about, so I mentioned earlier, I study race, media, and power, and for well over a decade, I've been studying Black Twitter, and I connect Black Twitter to a couple of different things. I connect it to the development of communities, but also to being a response to journalism and the way mainstream news media cover Black communities, and also thinking about the history of Black people using media technologies to advocate for their communities. And so I want to talk a little bit about that in framing my own comments about racialized disinformation. Just as a clarifier, Black Twitter is what I call a culturally linked network of people talking about issues of concern to Black communities on the platform known as Twitter. I'm never going to call it anything else. But I want to go back to the first newspaper that was published by three Black men in the United States. And that was in 1827. The paper was called Freedom's Journal. And this was back at a time where you didn't have much newsprint. Newsprint was really expensive. So whatever it was that you were going to say in your newspaper, you had to say it up front. And on the front cover of the first editorial that Freedom's Journal ran, one of the lines that often gets repeated is that too long have others spoken for us, we wish to plead our own cause. And in pleading their own cause, what the publishers of this newspaper were saying was that when we see coverage about Black people in this country, it often maligns, it presents us as deviant, it lumps us all together. We're talking about three Black men in a time where freedom wasn't available to everyone. And so there's this long history within Black media in particular of pushing back against racialized disinformation and using the media tools of the day to do so. I mentioned earlier that I am from Lexington, Kentucky, and I did that in part because I want to tell you a little story about my hometown paper. So in 2004, when I was on a break from my graduate journalism program, I went home and picked up the newspaper, and on the front page of the newspaper, and I should back up and say, I had to go out and buy the newspaper because my parents didn't buy, still won't buy, the local newspaper because they don't believe that it covers Black communities fairly. So I had to go out and buy the newspaper, and on the front page of the paper, below the fold, the paper printed this correction, if you will, and it said, it has come to the editor's attention that the Herald leader failed to cover the civil rights movement. And there was an apology, right? Failed to cover the entire civil rights movement. Now, we can talk about that choice of words, but it's an admission of how mainstream media has engaged in racialized disinformation in a couple of ways. So I think about what we call sin of omission versus the sin of commission, right? Sins of omission, where you leave something out, sins of commission, where you know what you're doing it on purpose. In this case, that racialized disinformation was omission, leaving out an entire story from the perspective of anyone, not just Black Lexingtonians, but anyone who was in that city and part of what was happening at the time, completely erasing that narrative. Fortunately, there were Black journalists in the city who were taking those pictures, writing the stories, compiling the stories, and so we have this record. And so to move that tradition to today, where I'm studying social media platforms and specifically how certain groups use these platforms to advocate for themselves, I'm reminded of the 2016 election with Hillary Clinton and Donald J. Trump. And one of the hashtags that circulated within Black Twitter at that time was, "Girl, I guess I'm with her." Where people were kind of reluctant to get on board with the Clinton campaign, but it presented this narrative that we weren't hearing much. The prevailing narrative about Black folks in the United States is that Black people in the US are Democrats, that they vote Democrat as a bloc, that they're pretty consistently relied upon, but that narrative obscures some of the realities about Black voting populations. And I think we're able to see more and more of that now as you see these conversations that are taking place within different communities that are linked online. You see those who say they're having trouble voting for the Harris-Walz ticket because of their support of Israel. You see others who say, well, Donald Trump gave us the stimulus, and so we're going to vote for him for this reason. You see others that say nothing has changed in all this time with all of us activating and voting for these different politicians. It's a reason for us to stay home. And within those conversations, there is room for continued misinformation and disinformation, not only about the community, but created within the community to circulate, that it finds sometimes a pretty fertile home among folks who have been so maligned in the press and have been ignored in the press, that they are used to reporting on their own stories, and sometimes that misinformation spreads within those networks in ways that aren't of obvious interest to the mainstream press, but are telltale indicators that misinformation is a problem within these communities as well. And just to end on this and clarify that specific point, I don't know how many people are familiar with this story, but I want to say it was 2 years ago, it might have been last summer. There was a story that bubbled up via Black Twitter that Tyler Perry, director in Atlanta, built his own studio, was trying to buy VH1 and another network. And I use that as an example of what racialized misinformation looks like in a very different way. So this isn't disinformation, it's not purposefully spread for a harmful reason, but it links into some of the old myths that circulate within Black communities. And in following that story and how widely it was reported in Black news media without the confirmation of sources outside of this one source that everyone kept going back to that suddenly disappeared when the story turned out to not to be true, we can use it as a pathway to think about how misinformation works in different communities. And so I'll stop there, but I'm looking forward to having this conversation about alternative takes on how we think about misinformation and disinformation, both in terms of what it means for a historical perspective and erasure, but also through some of the pathways that already exist in communities that are used to being ignored by the news.
All right, thank you. I get to go last, which is always a fun challenge because how do I speak in and around a number of the points that have sort of already been made. So what I'm going to do is just a few things that complement what my sort of colleagues have said today, and just to fill out, I think, some of the story before we jump into the moderation session. So first of all, picking up on Meredith's last point, that difference between mis and disinformation, right? So misinformation is information that's not true, but not spread with any particular intent. Whereas disinformation is the information that has a strategic intent attached to it. It's really in the space of disinformation, particularly disinformation that has an intent in order for people to gain politically from spreading it, that I want to focus on here, because I think this is very much what is most at play in the election that we're sort of seeing play out before us. The reality is that a significant percentage of disinformation is produced by white people, for white people, for the purposes of maintaining their dominant status at the top of the racial hierarchy in the United States. This was the story during the Reconstruction. It was the story during Southern redemption and Southern segregation. And it has been the story, one way or another, since that moment on, whether that's a Willie Horton ad, or whether that's various California propositions against immigrants, or whether that's the story we see now about votes being stolen by people who are not white. That's being drummed into people's heads. Disinformation is part of an explicit strategic politics of stoking backlash, often through hijacked victimhood appeal that's premised on inverting a moral order and an empirical reality being constructed where whites are now victims. We see this at all levels of the Republican Party, which is point number 2 that I wanted to make. Is that we tend to think about the presidential race being the presidential race between Donald Trump and Kamala Harris. And it is true that disinformation often comes from the top. But now the story that we're seeing is now how these disinformation campaigns are embedded at all levels of the contemporary Republican Party, from the local level all the way on up. And we're at a point now where you're seeing this backlash, this white backlash, to the point where whites don't want to give up their status and now are therefore unwilling to lose an election. As Du Bois noted 100 years ago, right, these appeals to race stands in and displaces a class politics. And in particular, a backlash to the erosion of what Du Bois called the psychological wages of whiteness, right? Where white status privilege is being under threat. That privilege being about deference, being about compensation, being about access. About having your predominantly white institutions arranged to serve whites in various ways is under very real threats, given the gains of people of color in strides towards equality over the last 20 years in the United States in particular. And what we see in our contemporary moment as backlash, as disinformation campaigns that are designed to stoke backlash, is coming in response to white status being very distinctly under threat. Another point that I think I want to add to the existing mix is we have asymmetric radicalization, asymmetric embrace of disinformation as a strategic tool. One side of the two-party divide is growing more extreme. That is the right, and it is the Republican Party broadly. And that's because the Republican Party, as Shannon mentioned earlier, represents a predominantly white coalition. This is something that is historically recent. It's about a realignment of the two parties after the civil rights movement. The civil rights movement basically worked within the Democratic Party and refashioned it into the multiracial, multi-ethnic party that it is today. In the 1960s and 70s, the Republican Party takes the opposite tack. It picks up former Southern segregationists. We move into a period of colorblind racism, right, where it is no longer normative to express racist views. So, as Eduardo Bonilla Silva sort of analyzed, institutions maintain primarily whiteness, but there's a colorblind way of talking about race where we can't actually talk about it. We have to talk about it through another example of disinformation, the welfare queen, which is coded as Black in the 1980s. Even though empirically, as a matter, Black women were no more likely to receive public assistance, in fact, less likely than white women. But that became a way in which you could talk about race without talking about race. All which sort of leads to our present moment, and why we sort of see this politics of disinformation and politics of backlash behind it. Democracy is eroding in the US because historically powerful groups no longer see democracy as a means to protect their political, economic, religious, social, and cultural position. And therefore, they're not holding on to democracy anymore. These conservative groups will buy into democracy as long as it solidifies their own position at the top of the racial hierarchy. Once that starts to leave, then you see the explicit rejection of democratic politics, which we see on display now, where you have years-long campaigns to undermine public confidence in the vote, where you see strategic and deliberate attempts to basically say, we are not going to accept the outcome of the election if our side does not win. And under any minimalist definition of democracy, at the bare minimum, we need a legitimate and peaceful transfer of holding of power through the ballot box. But we don't have that. We have an existential form of politics being propagated by the right. I think I was supposed to talk about policy, but I don't have any really good ideas, so I'm going to stop there, and we can jump into a Q&A.
Awesome. Thank you guys so much. So my first question is, what is the difference between mis and disinformation? I hear those two terms being used interchangeably, but they are different. So if you just highlight those differences.
Okay, sure. So I guess I'll quote Dean Freelon and his work, but Mis and disinformation is largely centered around this notion of intent. So whether or not the lies that are spread have been done so with the goal of malicious intent in mind. That being said, I have been doing a lot of work on participatory disinformation and kind of pushing back at the extent to which intent matters with regard to harm. And that in the beginning, when we were, wrapping our heads around all that was happening, I think intent was a very useful tool for like social network mapping and understanding the difference between a creator of disinformation and somebody, an audience member who might read it and share it. And so having that distinction of intent, I think when we were grappling with everything that was going on, but I, in a sense, thinking more about participatory disinformation and the extent to which intent is as useful of a marker.
Yeah, I would just add to that, that I've also been thinking about this sort of intent question, and like, I think that it can be sort of like overinterpreted as a way to scapegoat responsibility. Like, we can't know what's going on in someone's mind, right? In the same way that we've heard this, like, well, we'll call these, racially charged comments instead of like, this is a racist comment, because like, well, we can't know the heart and mind of the person who's saying this. And I worry that the intent portion of this disinformation definition kind of gives some permission to engage in a little bit of that too. Like, well, we don't know if someone intended to harm these people or intended to malign, this community, but we are all people here with eyes and ears, and if we think about these contexts, right, that we've been talking about, it's pretty clear why the intent behind a lot of the disinformation that we see, and so I worry a little bit about that intent part of it sometimes.
Thank you for that clarification. My next question is, what are some strategies people can use to identify that electoral disinformation, and what are some best practices for journalists in dealing with and figuring out how to convert electoral disinformation?
I can talk about strategies. But I can't talk about it in the same way in terms of some of the research that folks are doing about some of these strategies. I can't speak about this anecdotally. So one of the things that we keep in mind, especially in this era of hybrid media, where you have platforms alongside traditional media outlets and media sources, is that all of these things rely on a certain level of engagement, right? And for misinformation, for any information, disinformation specific, to travel from one place to another, it relies on people and their interaction. So online, when we encounter disinformation, one of the first tactics that we can take is by not directly interacting with it. Because the platforms don't quantify whether your intent is to highlight that something is untrue or not. The platform simply quantify the fact that you interacted with it. And we think about how algorithms prioritize information based on interaction, time spent, shares, whether we like something or not, and that being a catalyst for moving disinformation through a system. I think, Shannon, you raised this point earlier about moving a story up the chain, and another way that we can think about that and stopping that story from moving up the chain in reporting practices is by exercising discernment and thinking about what we're reporting, how it's being reported, and to what end. And the example I use for that is that in the debate, Donald Trump, when he mentioned they are eating cats and dogs, if you go back and read the transcript, you will see that he never mentioned a specific group of people. What happened was that J.D. Vance had made this claim about Springfield, Ohio, and what he calls criminality of Haitian immigrants there, taking the story of one Haitian immigrant who was driving without a license, struck a bus, killed a child, and extrapolating that to all Haitians everywhere, which still has absolutely nothing to do with eating cats and dogs, but in fact just evokes this old trope about people being different and them eating something like a household pet, which tugs on the affect, the heartstrings of people who are pet owners. And in the United States, I believe there are more pets than there are people. So a great way to connect with a number of different audiences. Those two things were separate. Those two mentions were separate. The only piece of information that connected them was the mention of Springfield, Ohio. It was journalists in mainstream media that put those things together, which allowed this narrative to circulate about Haitian immigrants in Springfield, Ohio, eating pets. And so if we think about how that comment could have been reported, how even that connection could have been made and put in context, we see the opportunity to keep that sort of disinformation from being built via the tools of news media and journalism as they exist, but also from not circulating in ways and being given new life and amplified in ways that would have moved beyond the debate without, or wouldn't have moved beyond the debate without mainstream media connecting the dots.
Yeah, I mean, I think that was exactly right, and that was anything but anecdotal. So I think that, and this goes back to the intent question, right? So like, Trump clearly wanted everyone to be talking about that the next day because he lost the debate, right? So one of the ways that you get your message out, if you want to mostly appeal to whites and you want to get them afraid about immigrants and other people, is say something that the media is then going to play a game of fill in the blank on and endlessly report. And in the old days, right, you might say, well, that might have sunk your candidacy. But in a politics of attention era, where these things then get circulated and recirculated on social media and engaged with and amplified, well, guess what we're talking about instead of the fact that Trump lost the debate? We're talking about Haitian immigrants eating pets, right? And then this exactly goes back to this point of like, then they doubled down in the days afterwards. They didn't walk anything back because they knew that everyone was talking about exactly what they wanted to talk about. It's playing into that electoral coalition. And again, this is the intent piece, right? So like media needs to be aware when you are literally amplifying the things that they want this election to be about, and you're doing the work for them. So it's requiring that reflexivity, that reflectiveness on the part of the media and on the part of all of us to not amplify strategic narratives that seek to frame things on your opponent's terms. And if your opponent here is somebody who's rejected electoral democracy and rejected a pluralistic democracy, don't feed into those narratives. The second thing that I would say, and I think the press needs to do much better about this, is having coverage through the lens of democracy, what we've called democracy-worthy policies. We did a big study with a former PhD student, now on faculty at UMass Amherst, TC Jang, where we analyzed press coverage of election deniers on the ballot in 2022. And what we found is that most outlets across the country did an awful job when it came to covering election deniers on the ballot. They very rarely fact-checked candidates who stated that the 2020 elections were false, or that they wouldn't accept the results of the 2022 elections, or claims that the 2022 elections weren't going to be secure. Even more than that, we wanted to hold them to a higher standard. We said they need to also embrace the fact that elections are an important part of democratic norms, and respecting their outcomes in free and fair elections are part of the fabric of what makes us a democracy. They almost never embrace this wider framing of alerting the public to these threats to democracy. And the press as an institution has failed in this regard, just as platforms have failed in this regard. Platforms operate at the level of policy towards embracing this freedom of expression regardless of the consequences. Regardless of the fact that we've seen repeatedly, not just in the United States, but around the world, Bolsonaro is another great example, of politicians who have specifically spread disinformation in order to undermine their accountability at the ballot box. Platforms have not done a good job figuring out when one person's right to expression on those platforms take away other people's, such as the public's right to collective expression through the ballot box. And they've drawn this line repeatedly sort of wrong, right? So we need media institutions to perform better, to act as democratic gatekeepers to safeguard democracy. In terms of your question of what we can all do better, this is where like the New Jersey in me comes out. Smiling at the back of the room again, right? So like, if you've spent time in New Jersey or Coney Island or other places, like you go and you get shaken out at the boardwalk, right? Like they want you to spend a lot of money. It's kind of that art of the con, right? Where they're like, just one more game, right? Disinformation benefits certain people. When you see information online, like before you believe that it's true, like be like, well, then whose interest does me believing this thing is true serve? Right? Like that works not just buying a pair of sneakers or a watch or whatever else, like the grift is of the day that they're trying to sell you. But it also works that like if something seems to be running counter to your intuition or doesn't quite seem to be in your interest to believe, that's when you should be thinking sort of critically about, am I being conned here? Right? Is there this deep, why should I hate that? Maybe I shouldn't hate that person, or maybe I shouldn't think differently about this person because it's going to benefit someone else. I mean, I'm just skeptical by nature when it comes to these things, but I think like recovering this story of the con and thinking about to whose benefit is it that I believe in these things, often is a way to sort of spotting and identifying this stuff in the wild as we see it.
And I would just add to that, not only stuff that you have like a gut instinct might, I don't know, feel a little weird, it might be not true, but I would say for like individual people, you know, Meredith was talking about like the way that we react, right, to these things. If something makes you like really like feels really good and affirming, or makes you feel really bad, you know, and angry, both those emotions are reasons to take like a pause, right? To engage in some of this skepticism, you know, of like, what does this do, right? And I think that can happen with like really negative feelings and also really positive feelings. Both of those things lead to engagement. Which not only, you know, furthers the spread of something if it's being spread on a social media platform, but also turn into metrics that are picked up then by the press to say like, oh, look, this is the thing that people are talking about because it's gotten X many number of shares and X many number of retweets and whatever. So on the individual level, I think, you know, if it's a super strong emotional reaction, engage in some of this stuff that my colleagues are talking about. And then I would say like from the press's perspective, like holy cow, there's a lot, and like I'd be happy to like share all the resources that our team has come up with around this sort of democracy framed election coverage. But you know, in the same way that journalists and scholars of journalism have rightly critiqued objectivity as being basically a view from whiteness and being this sort of morally vacuous way of viewing the world. I would say the same thing sort of around journalists and the press being able to point out the democratic stakes of some of these discussions that we're having. Just as morally vacuous as objectivity can be, the way it's performed a certain way, so too can it be morally vacuous to have this view from nowhere vis-a-vis democracy. The press doesn't exist if we don't have a democracy, either like literally as a function or even from a business perspective, because guess what? Businesses don't do that well in not a democracy either. And so having this view from nowhere that there's nothing at stake here and we're just reporting, right, on what's going on, even when one candidate, you know, or one party is engaged in this sort of fascist behavior, is not actually a view from nowhere. That's a view that comes from a place of considerable privilege and power and sort of a denial of what is happening. And I think it's really unfortunate that we've ended up in this situation. And I think this is, again, not necessarily the fault of like individual journalists, though like I got some people at the New York Times that I've got some beef with, but more so the system, right, of the press that says you should be objective, and that objectivity means not having eyes to look at what's around you, right, and stating a point that is a point, what is happening.
I just want to quickly note that reframing objectivity to mean covering both sides of an argument is a disinformation campaign.
Yeah.
That's not what objectivity means. It was a very concerted strategy to reframe how journalism operates. Put that last bit in.
Thank you. Yes, my next question is, we talked a lot about the history and the role that, history plays, in this. And my next question is, how are current racialized disinformation practices building on historical patterns of propaganda targeting minority communities? Who are the main actors behind these campaigns, and how can ethnic media outlets and
So this is funny, you get to watch professors think in real time. It's been all that along. I want to go back to my opening comments about Freedom's Journal and the editorial and the proclamation that these publishers knew that Black communities were being covered in ways that weren't accurate or fair, right? If you start back even further and thinking about what racial capitalism is and how it brings us to this moment, the fundamental myth about disinformation, the fundamental disinformation campaign about communities of color is that the racial hierarchy that we have in this country and throughout the world is the way that things should be. And so everything that we see that is developed out of that is, in fact, disinformation strategy. They become more sophisticated over time, they become more intricate over time, but all of this is connected to this central lie. So I think about some of the things that I've heard and seen in this particular election, things that don't necessarily appear to be disinformation, but are. So if you think about the Black jobs comment, that immigrants are coming and they're taking Black jobs, that is a disinformation strategy that attempts to shatter any coalition between races and on the basis of class. Like, there is implicit in that line that there's a certain kind of job that is a Black job. And it's what one would call low skilled, which in itself is another disinformation strategy, because there is no job that is a low skilled job. I can't pluck and clean chickens for my own self, let alone anyone else. Like, we depend on people who are often called low skilled to keep us fed, to keep us alive, right? But that is a strategy that's used to, again, shatter those coalitions and keep people see each other as the enemy. And I take on that, one of the quotes, and this is my personal beef. I hear people say all the time, they misquote the line from Audre Lorde that the master's tools will not dismantle the master's house. And that is not about repeating some of the same practices that we have, say, in academia or in business or what have you. It is about using tactics of stratification and pitting groups against each other, and recognizing that emphasizing difference is the master's tool, and that is not going to dismantle the master's house. Like, we cannot build, or we cannot tear down the master's house if we're all separate, right? If we're all thinking about our own interests and pitted against one another. So this long way around to think about how ethnic media can take this question on is connecting the history that we have, seeing what's been reported, how that information in the past sort of relates to what we're talking about now. Like, I would really like to see, in specific, ethnic press take up some of the references that are being made on the right that are just thinly veiled throwbacks to segregation. Like, when J.D. Vance talks about remanding, the abortion rights to as part of the states' rights, using that phrase, states' rights, should set off alarm bells in everyone's mind. Because when we talked about states' rights before, we were talking about segregation. If ever there were a place for the ethnic press to pick up on something, it's in those coded messages that folks from different groups have had to learn because it was a way for people to signal to dominant groups that this is how we're going to keep these people separate and continue to oppress them. So that was a long way of talking about it, but that's where I think the ethnic press should pick up on the disinformation strategies.
Okay, pick up on that point, right? So to Meredith's point, this is a playbook that has been crafted over generations, if not centuries. And you see this everywhere. So more proximately, when you talk about this continuity with history, right? Think about the ways in which these appeals made, for instance, to Cuban Americans in South Florida that Kamala Harris and the Democratic Party are communists, are socialists, as being an appeal to reflect a particular group and a particular group's experience of history in ways that connects to the ways in which Dr. Martin Luther King and other civil rights leaders were also portrayed as communists. Were also portrayed as being part of this Cold War struggle where any internal push for equality was always reflective of some larger interest that was considered un-American and enrolled in this larger struggle of geopolitics. I did a paper a few years back studying the racial propaganda around Kamala Harris during her bid for the White House in 2000. Oh, and guess what? When she's a major party nominee, that playbook is sitting right there. So there's the othering narrative that she's different. There's the essentializing narrative, she's not Black. And then to Asian communities, she's not actually Asian, right? There's the model minority myths that are used to draw cleavages between various racial and ethnic groups in order to pit them against one another and not part of coalitions. And it's all right there on display. I mean, that's kind of the thing I think that I find so striking about Meredith's point. None of this is new. It just gets recycled and it might take different forms and the stories might be a little bit different, but that genre is the same. And that genre just plays on the same sort of set of tired, well-worn tropes. And we know what the strategy is going to be, and that playbook has infinite variations on that theme. But once you see it there, and you see it sort of play out over and over and over and over again, and it's done to delegitimize some set of group or some set of coalition of people who are not white and not white Christian as being somehow other and therefore illegitimate. Because at the end of the day, they're defending a certain version of America that looks like themselves.
I want to make it local real quick. So talk about well-worn tropes. We have a lot of races going on, obviously, besides the presidential race. And in North Carolina, we have an election for the state superintendent of public schools. Statewide election, okay? One of the candidates, the Republican nominee for this position, has engaged in the rhetoric that a lot of her counterparts also engaged in around what is called school choice, right? Which is another word for segregation and giving vouchers to private schools and then unfunding public schools is another way of creating a school system that is separate and unequal, which we're not supposed to have, according to a Supreme Court ruling from a long time ago. And so again, we see this sort of well-worn trope, and to not be able to place what those things are within the historical context of what are the actual, in this case, educational systems that these policies would create, which is an educational system of separate and unequal, and the long and sordid and terrible history of a separate and unequal education system in this country is to not inform communities about what are the stakes of these policies, because tying them to things like school choice and vouchers and not understanding the context of what those are sort of not only code words for, but what they would in fact do as a policy to a school system I think is one of the campaigns engaged in this election, not just in our state, but I care a lot about it in this state because I live here, but also because I send my kids to public school, and because I deeply believe in public schools as a product of them entirely.
Thank you. Now we're gonna open up the floor to any questions.
So this is my first election voting, and I was kind of, excited before, but this election has been a lot more stressful to me than I feel like it's been hopeful. And it's been just so many different extremes that we kind of have to look at and see in the media. Do you think that it's going to continue this way, or is it because of the specific candidate that we have now?
I'll just say one thing briefly. First of all, it's very exciting that it's your first election, and I'm sorry that it's this one. But I'm going to say two quick things. One, I'm going to repeat, in not as eloquent terms, because I can't remember it, what I heard someone say on TikTok, which I am just holding as like a mantra to myself, which is the great anxiety we feel is also a representation of the great hope that we have for what may be possible. And our anxiety about it is because we have this great hope. And so like, I'm just gonna share that with you because I'm just like this to myself. But I have to say, in some ways, this is a little bit about, the candidates in this particular election, but I think it's also about the stakes, right? This election, and I know we've heard this now for a couple elections, but because it's true, is about whether we're gonna have a democracy, right? Like in the starkest terms. And it's also about what kind of country do we want to be, not just like politically, but culturally. I'm gonna, again, not as eloquently as she did, but quote our fabulous colleague, Jessica Cottom, who's also a professor here in the New York Times columnist, who talked about this in response to the Madison Square Garden rally the other day, right? She's talking about, yes, democracy is what we're voting on. What kind of country are we going to have? And is it going to be a democracy? But also, what kind of country are we going to have, like, culturally? Like, what kind of country are we going to have? Is it going to be okay to say the kind of vile things that we heard, for example, at that rally? Or are we going to be a kind of country that says, oh, that's like a little bit that's too far. That's not who we're going to be. And so, to some extent, that's about the candidates, but it's also about the candidates are a reflection of the party. And imperfect as they may be, I can't imagine a greater representation of it than, in fact, the two candidates we have of the coalition of what one party looks like and the coalition of what another party looks like.
Just really briefly to that. One of the things that irks me most about this particular election season is the framing that, and this is no slight to anyone, but democracy is on the ballot. Because yes, democracy is on the ballot in this election, but democracy is on the ballot every single election. If we think about how we got to this point, there have been coordinated strategies that have been 50 and 60 years in the making that are now manifesting because of, I would say it's easy to say a lack of voter engagement, but we've got to think about gerrymandering. And how did we get gerrymandering? We get it from elected officials, right? I encourage people to think not about just how stressful this particular election is, but put it in the context of, as Shannon was saying, what is possible and what is possible over time, right? So as not to be fatigued by this election and think that at midterms, all right, however it goes, it's set and either things are fine or things are terrible, somewhere in between, and I don't have to vote, or I don't have to pay attention to what's down ballot on my ballot, or I don't have to pay attention to the local races or what have you. But thinking that the stakes are equally as high every single time, and the election being the high point, because there's so much more that happens in between elections and in election years, whether that is shifting lines of voting districts or policies that are implemented based on ballot initiatives that are passed or what have you. Just sort of reframing the way that we think about what elections are and how much work there is to be done every time they come around.
Hi, everybody. My name is Chrisanne Bennett, and I came to visit this session from Duke's Day. Don't eat me too much. And I really found it chapter, and thank you so much for inviting me. My question is more about racialization in general. I know you guys are great minds in the field. In the class, we talked about the past dog whistle politics being used, and hearing the regarding hearing about that rally that just recently was interesting because there's so much more sensationalism now, and so many things that are overt and allowed in the media. My question is more so, how do you guys think that the growth of social media and those interactions are one influencing sensationalism, and how that would then impact, I guess, social cohesion in the future? Because TikTok, Instagram, X, Twitter have become echo chambers, and they're scrolling, and it sounds like you're hearing from different people, but it's really just more people who are more like you. And so it's tricking people into thinking that they're diversifying their opinions when we're really not. So what can younger voters do to kind of decrease that impact?
I'll just say one quick thing, and please, and ask everyone else to please come in, which is that, yes, right, social media platforms absolutely play a role in sensationalizing, in highlighting divisions, you know, and exacerbating them without a doubt, right? But our social media platforms are created by people in our society, right? And so, and what happens on them every day is, right, not only the sort of infrastructure, but also what happens on them. And so they also just reflect, right, what are divisions, right, in our society, and how the sensationalism works in creating those divisions. There's just as much, you know, when I, right before I started grad school, this is in 2012, I guess when I was applying, I was like, well, I'm kind of interested in this like social media thing. And people were like, okay, well, that's probably not gonna matter for politics. But because what a lot of people were paying attention to, and especially shortly before then, was the sensationalization of cable news. And then after that, blogs, and how these things were gonna divide us all, and, you know, we were all gonna think the same thing. And I don't mean that at all to minimize your fears. I mean it to say, like, this is a robust and good concern that we have, but it's a concern we have about a lot of media platforms and the way that they change over and over again. And so a way to not get too disheartened just by, you know what I mean, the media system that you find yourself in this moment, because these are fears that are real, but they are also fears that are repeated over and over again about, you know, when sort of new platforms and new media systems come up. And they are real fears, but they are also not deterministic in terms of like, this is exactly what is gonna happen because of what it looks like in a particular media system.
All right. Thank you and welcome. It's a great question. I have a lot of complicated feelings about it. So you mentioned sort of solidarity, right? The thing is, I'm not sure we were ever at a point where we had greater solidarity. I think the challenges to solidarity that were written on dominant groups' terms were just not as visible as they are today. And therefore the backlash that was not as visible. Juliet Hooker is a political theorist at Brown, has written a series of works about, in particular, how Black movements have been portrayed as threats to solidarity when they push for equality. And her argument is that we shouldn't value cohesion, for instance, above all else. We shouldn't value cohesion above equality. We shouldn't value cohesion over Black lives. That the movements that we see that have pushed for equality often cause that polarization, that lack of cohesion. But they're what's required to get us, to move us forward, right? To be that vision of a multiracial, multi-ethnic democracy that I think all of us in this room ultimately are striving for and see. I think another aspect of this too, and I know Dr. Clark has a book coming out about this, which I will plug because it's brilliant, is those very same mechanisms on social media that amplify attention and engagement also make movements strong, right? And if it wasn't for the filming of police violence and then the amplification of a sensationalistic act of violence, of murder, right, that caused us all to bear witness and not turn away, I'm not sure that we would have ever had such vocal cries for justice. What Dean Freelon and Meredith in another piece have noted was the largest mass mobilization in American history. And I don't think you can think about that scale separate and apart from the mediums through which it was made possible and was organized and was made visible, and what Alyssa Richardson has called sort of continues this tradition of Black witnessing. That looks different in different eras, but this was a part and an extension of it. So I guess all the way back to your question, whether we will see now more of the express racism that we saw at Madison Square Garden out in the open again. I think that's long been the story of American history. It's just maybe we've had a blip where it's gone underground. The political rally immediately I went to was 1938, 1939, when 25,000 fascists marched at Madison Square Garden in solidarity with the Nazis, dressed in brown shirts. That spectacular violence and racism, to me at least, has been America's historic norm. I think we pushed it below the surface for a time. We adopted the colorblind racism. I think now the visibility of it comes proportionate to the challenge to it. And to me, at least, it's about heightening the challenge to it, to move beyond it. That's sort of the call and the task for all of us moving ahead. This election is a step toward that. It won't be the end of it. And I think that's the other piece. Trump represents forces, he did not cause them. He's the outcome of those forces of American history, not the originator. And I think there are many waiting in the wings to take that mantle, and this is exactly where we come in and our generational struggle comes in. I don't know, Meredith, I'm sure your book has a lot more insights on that than I could.
I really liked all of your talks. I just want to let you know, but so from what I've noticed, especially like it's kind of like rising within my age group, but especially like within like the I'd say like the middle age group, is that centrism is like at an all-time high, and I feel like it's also presented as this ideology that's like the in between of Republicans and Democrats, and they're extreme on both ends, and they're both wrong. And centrism is like this like perfect safe place. However, I firmly believe that centrism is a state of capitalism, right? But I'm wondering, how do you think disinformation plays a role in pushing that narrative that centrism is kind of like this correct and safe ideology for America?
All right, I'm gonna go off on this, because I mean, I mentioned this a little bit earlier, but this idea that we ever had this past where everyone agreed and there weren't extremes or we were sort of agreeing on things is premised not only, is first of all not true, but it's also that agreement that it looked like we had for a little while as a country was just premised on an agreement between the two parties to oppress the same people. Right, and that's what the consensus, this mythical sort of consensus looked like. And as Daniel was sort of mentioning in his answer to the last question, this idea that cohesion, and this centrism, which I think is very, aligned with that, is this normative thing that we should be going to flies in the face of what it might look like to actually have a functioning multiracial, multi-ethnic democracy. The concerns of polarization, we hear this all the time in the press, in research, in the millions of dollars that organizations are giving out to fund research around this. But if we all could just talk to one another, if we could talk across the divide, right, then our country could heal itself because we could find common sense within one another. Yeah, first of all, we've got to talk, and second of all, how can you talk across lines of denial of people's human rights and civil rights, right? Where is the middle between denying someone's actual existence and anything else, right? Like whatever the other opposing viewpoint is. And so I think that we can't think about the lack of cohesion, right, and this sort of centrist idea as being something that is something that we should sort of, say as a norm that we should be striving towards, because that's putting our thumb on the scale of social cohesion instead of equality, right, and justice. And so I agree with you, and I'm sorry for the frustration of this sort of centrist idea, because I do think that this really is about not only a tale of disinformation of this consensus in the past, but also this is about this idea that the middle is the right path. And when the two poles are not only not equidistant, but one represents an anti-democratic point of view that would deny the human and civil rights of other people, like I'm not interested in finding that middle point wherever it is, because that doesn't actually move us towards a democracy. And to Meredith's point earlier about it's not just this election, it's every election, it's all the things that happen in between. Democracy is not a noun, it's a verb. It's an action that we have to do every day and all the time, right? In small and in big ways to keep us moving that way. But one way I know that we will not get there is by trying to find some mythical center.
Hi, my question is, since there's these people and groups that are intentionally spreading this disinformation, how do you hold those people and groups accountable?
I can take a shot at that, because I spend a lot of time arguing with social media companies about what they should do. So at the very least, we shouldn't tolerate it, right? Like, so the thing about, you often hear claims that the First Amendment protects, right? The right of people to spread disinformation on social media platforms, on social media sites. That's not true. There's no First Amendment protection from Facebook. The First Amendment protects you from government saying you can't say something. Facebook, Instagram, X, Twitter, TikTok, Snapchat, they set their own rules for speech. Because the Supreme Court in the United States has long said that if you own a platform or an internet site or newspaper, you get to choose what gets published in those pages. You don't have a First Amendment right to show up on the op-ed page of the New York Times. You don't have the First Amendment right to publish an editorial in the Washington Post. Turns out the Washington Post reporters don't have a First Amendment right to publish an editorial in the Washington Post either, right? The other does, right? So in any event, the First Amendment protects Facebook from the government. It doesn't give you access to things. All of which means that like platforms can go a lot farther than they actually do, and they should. One thing that we do know from research literature is deplatforming works. Deplatforming takes away revenue models, it takes away attention models, it marginalizes voices who would seek to harm public discourse in some way or harass people. When you think about people like Alex Jones, for instance, who has long monetized hate, scandal, conspiracy, including denying that Sandy Hook happened, and lost court cases on the basis of it. Platforms could have done much more, much sooner to prevent the harms that they cause. So at a bare minimum, I would say the institutions that we have, like platform companies, should recognize the harms that these people cause and deplatform them from their sites. To me at least, I think the evidence is pretty clear that that would go a long way to checking their revenue streams, to checking their ability to amplify information that's threatening and dangerous to a group of people. I think this goes back to some of our earlier conversation too, is why is it that I still end up seeing everything Trump posts on True Social? It's not because I'm following Trump on True Social, it's because it's being amplified constantly in the legacy professional press and talked about all the time. Well, guess what? It's exactly the ways that Trump used Twitter. He would post something on Twitter knowing full well that it would set the entire discourse of the media system. It's gaming those mechanics. And it's also about legacy media systems turning away from the profit incentive that that offers in order to serve a public interest. To say, we know people are tuning into this because it's scandalous, but we're not going to give oxygen and air to content that's going to be undermining of American elections, because Shannon's point earlier, guess what? We can only have a free press in a democracy. So therefore, why are we aiding and abetting those who are looking to dismantle it? I think those are the two biggest things, the biggest ways to counter it. It has to come from our media institutions. They have to be democratic gatekeepers. There's very little we can do as individuals. I mean, this is a bigger structural problem. Although I would say, and I had a whole class earlier today where we talked endlessly about this, is that we're also citizens, right? So we have a set of obligations. We have to vote. If you have a certain set of privileges, like I do as a white man, like I have to be a voice to talk to other people of parts of dominant groups in order to challenge them, in order to move us towards this vision of the multi-ethnic, multi-racial democracy premise on equality. I have a certain set of obligations as somebody who represents a particular group. And we also have to come and try to speak across lines of difference. And we have to meet people where they are, but also with the moral clarity of the change that we want to see, right? So I think those are the things that we can then do in our own individual lives as democratic citizens.
I will just add that canceling works, and that some of the things that we need to do don't adhere to what has been normative in terms of decorum and decency and what have you. There is a moment in which you just have to call people out and organize against them to stop them from doing whatever harmful thing it is that they're doing. One of the examples that I take is from the AP Style book. The AP Style book did not add racist as a term of use until 2019. So if we think about the AP Style book, which is the guide that journalists are trained on, it's a convention for news writing. Everyone, whether you're in journalism, PR, advertising, you get training on the AP Style book. You're supposed to know and use its conventions in your writing. Basically, journalists did not have the go-ahead or the sanctioned language to call something racist. It was because of all the hell-raising that happened between 2016 and 2018 that the AP Style book editors decided to look at coverage and some of the entries that they had and add racist. Canceling works. Like, it's the reason that Dr. Phil yesterday at that rally said, if you say a certain thing, and the first thing he said, the first threat that he made was that you will be canceled. No one has been canceled into jail. People have been held accountable for things that they have done and prosecuted accordingly. No one has been canceled to, do something rash, right? We could talk about bullying and that being something different, but organizing to confront people and call them out on their bad behavior is another tactic that we can, and we really have to take. Like, it's time for us to stop being polite and to actually take these things.
I think we should mic drop on that.
Right, so I wanted to ask why you think that the term, campaign slogan is like being so culturally relevant, right? Like when you ran and it became a racial undertone.
I'll start, but I'm sure I can say on that.
I think Make America Great Again is actually indicative of what happened in Madison Square Garden rally. So the greatness that many who attended and cheered on at that rally was to be able to say things without a dog whistle, was to just be openly racist without having to worry about being politically correct. It is a desire to be in a space where men who look and act like Donald Trump continue to be in positions of power. And I think why it works so well is that it also is tied to this nostalgia for something that never existed, where everyone got along, but the reason everyone got along is because both parties were united in the goal of disenfranchisement. And as more people got the right to vote, there became these ruptures and these reasons for disagreement. And so the desire to make America great again is reminiscent for this past that didn't exist, while glossing over all the horrible parts of that past. And so that's why I think it's so sure.
I also think because it's this again, and because if you understand what we want to go to again, creates, you know, in its opposition, a strong reaction, right? Like, if I'm put that, I'm like, that's bad, like, I don't want to go back to that, right? That was really bad, it is provoking, and that's also what is desirable about it, right? Like the righteous anger, this like adopted victimhood that's not actually real, that people who support this, and so it sticks because it allows you to be in a position where your political statement makes you feel like you are being attacked because people have a completely rational reaction to it of like, oh, no, we're not going back to that, right? And it provokes a sort of emotional and affective back and forth that is culturally and emotionally and politically powerful. I also think because it's like just a couple words, it's been, you know, it's like a meme, it fits on the hat, like it's literally all the like cultural and material products around it too that I think make it really sticky and successful, right, as like a political slogan. And I should know this, but I'm tired, y'all. It was also, like, who else's presidential campaign slogan was this?
Ronald Reagan.
Thank you. So it's also like literally there, you know what I mean? Like in our brains and in our cultural history. And so it taps in, you know what I mean, to this as well. And so I think there's probably more reasons, but that's at least some.
I'll add one more. The thing that you have to keep in mind about Donald Trump is that between 2004 and 2017, Donald Trump was on television every single week in the United States via The Apprentice. And everyone knows that phrase, "you're fired," right? So you've got this person who has been able to present himself on television for over a decade, who's come up with this catchphrase, and it's everything that Shannon said. It's short, it's snappy, it evokes nationalism and this mythic past that people are nostalgic for a time when they didn't have to deal with the discomfort of others, right? But you cannot ignore the pathway that is already there, the foundation that is there by Donald Trump being a pop culture figure in terms of both The Apprentice and then when I think about other communities, like rappers used to talk about Donald Trump all the time. So you've got this cultural resonance where because of who is saying it and how they've had exposure in the past, there is schema that people have for it to stick to that makes it very, very, very effective.
Let's give it for our panelists one more time. Thank you so much for joining us, guys, and thank you all for our audience for joining and participating in our conversation. We hope that you enjoyed it, that you have a great rest of your evening.
Thank you. Thank you. Great, thank you. No, it's good.